So, look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state. So tell me, Brad, what are we going to do? We won the election, and it's not fair to take it away from us like this.
That was President Trump pressuring the Secretary of State of Georgia to find votes, nobody is quite sure from where, that would overturn the federal election results in that state. Meanwhile, the Senate runoff election in Georgia has concluded, and based on the numbers at the time of this taping, the Democrats have won at least one seat and possibly both, which would mean the Senate will be split down the middle, with Vice President-elect Kamala Harris providing the tie-breaking vote. I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times. Welcome to the New York Times Close Up. But the runoff election is not the final piece of drama for this election cycle. The Electoral College vote, normally a simple procedural event overseen by the vice president, was turned by President Trump into yet another stress test on democracy. Are the efforts by the president and his Republican allies enough to overturn the will and the votes of the American people? All this is happening, of course, against the backdrop of a continuing coronavirus pandemic and an uneven vaccine rollout across the country. Here to discuss these final days of the Trump administration and the president's final efforts to overturn an election are New York Times contributing writers Eleanor Randolph and Clyde Haberman. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us. When we look back over history, we see that President John Adams presided over the Alien and Sedition Acts. Lincoln presided over the suspension of habeas corpus. FDR presided over the internment of Japanese during World War II. How does Donald Trump's assault on democracy compare to those? Clyde?
Well, it's pretty serious. Okay, it's not the same as interning Japanese Americans, for sure, but it is a frontal assault on every aspect of our democratic processes. And although, we're taping before the action in Congress Wednesday afternoon, but and I presume, President-elect Biden will indeed be upheld, but the severe denting of our democratic processes can't be simply dismissed as theater. Every one of it is, as far as I'm concerned, frankly, sedition, and these are acts of near treason on the part of people like Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley and all the rest. The Republicans increasingly refuse to accept any election result that is not clearly a victory by them. And if we have one of our major parties not accepting a fundamental aspect of democracy, which includes sometimes you're going to lose, then the whole system breaks down. They have sold themselves, a good part of that party, lock, stock, and barrel to Donald Trump. And that's just a fool's errand. But I wouldn't care so much, except that it's our democracy that they're trashing in the process. It's very serious.
Eleanor, I know this is a terribly hypothetical question, but do they really believe in what they're doing, or is this total grandstanding, positioning themselves for a possible run in 2024 or some other craven political act on their part?
No, for one thing, I think, going back to what Clyde was saying, I think this is the stress test that we have never had on our democracy. And the hope is that that the people who care about that, which is, I think, 70 million people, that we will look at where the weaknesses seem to be and shore up the whole election process. But in terms of where we go now, I think the Republicans are really splitting into two parties, and you are seeing the Romney Republicans, and actually Mitch McConnell seems to be part of that group now, because he's trying to be sort of the somewhere in the middle of the Republican road here. But this group of sort of, wackos by my lights, are really trying to make names for themselves, which is always what politicians try to do on some level. But if they're going to go into the 2024 elections, they're looking at Donald Trump as a possible candidate. So instead of fighting somebody like Romney, who sounds so sensible in comparison, they're really looking at Donald Trump and Donald Trump's following. And so what if we make it to January 20th in one piece? That's what I'm going to watch for. What happens to the Republicans when they're, fighting tooth and nail?
I was struck very much,
Clyde,
if I just quickly can add, by the letter that these 10 former defense secretaries wrote as an op-ed in the Washington Post. One of the striking things was that it was organized, that letter, by Dick Cheney, of all people, who, if we were taping this 4 years ago, Dick Cheney would have been, our bugaboo for, awful anti-democratic figure. He's now, by comparison to the president and his minions, now he is an upholder of democracy. Our country is being turned upside down almost every day.
Clyde, I know it's hard to prove intent in various legalities, but was Trump's phone call to the Georgia Secretary of State an impeachable offense?
Oh, I guess that's hard to, I would think so. Look, I think it's a jailable offense, but I'm not a prosecutor, and I know some people would
You'd
talk
like
about
to
it.
be, though.
Well, on any given day. But, by the time the show airs, it's going to be something like 11 or 12 days left in this presidency. I don't see the point of talking about impeachment now, just getting him out of office. And now there's a lot of damage he could still do in his 11 days. I have no doubt, or little doubt, that he will pardon himself and anybody who's ever crossed his path. So there's still an awful lot. And on foreign affairs, there's no way to be sure that he won't invent some sort of casus belli against Iran, for example. There's still an awful lot of mischief that can be done. I never thought that I would be looking toward the military to uphold our democratic processes, but that's exactly where we are right now. It is clear that people like General Mark Milley are not going to allow themselves to be part of a coup. That we're even using words like coup in terms of the United States government is of itself, again, an indication of how much damage this president has done to our systems.
Eleanor, we look closer to home to Andrew Cuomo and the former Republican state Senate in New York. The governor was able to use that as a foil for a lot of the programs that liberal Democrats wanted. He could blame the Republicans for not getting that passed. Is Joe Biden going to be happier with a split Congress or with a totally Democratic Congress?
Mitch McConnell is so capable of blocking everything that I think Biden will probably be, I know he'll be better off with a Democratic Congress, at least for a while. I mean, the thing is, what we very often see is 2 years later, the voters swing. They decide they like a split government instead of one party running everything. And so in some ways, if Biden gets a Democratic Senate, he will have 2 years to do what he really wants to do. And we'll see, efforts on climate change. We might see a tax rollback. That would be interesting, to say the least. We almost certainly will see an infrastructure program that has been promised forever and will make a lot of difference, especially for those of us in New York who want to ride the subway, at least eventually. And, you know, some support for states. New York is not the only state that's suffering, but New York certainly is. You know, a $14 billion deficit is no small change. So if he gets a Democratic Senate, he will have at least a short period to get things done. And you know, I wouldn't count on the next round of votes after 2022.
Will New Yorkers be any better off with a New Yorker as Senate Majority Leader?
Huh, that's a good question. I would like to think so. Now he's going to be up for election. This would be Chuck Schumer in next year. I keep forgetting we're in 2021. Yeah, it has to be better for New York. I don't, at the least, I can't see how it can hurt. But I think Biden will be challenged on the left within the Democratic Party. I don't think people like Bernie Sanders are going to remain quiescent for very, very long. Or folks like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and so on. So he will probably get some flack from the left of his party because basically he's composed a government that is Obama redux. And so a lot of those folks were not happy with the Obama years. So we'll see to what degree does he catch the flack, not only from the Republicans on the right, but from his own party on the left.
Clyde, you covered the Middle East for the Times. Could we give Trump any credit for what's been going on in the Middle East lately in terms of better relations with Israel and some of the Arab states?
With some of the Arab states, for sure. Better relations with Israel? No, it's better relations with a very right-wing government in Israel, which and whose leader is under criminal indictment. Which, by the way, our president may be at some point. New York State hasn't finished with him in terms of criminal actions that are possible. I think a lot of the stuff that they did are very appealing to Jews who fall on the political right, but they're really basically meaningless. Moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, shutting down the American ambassadorial presence in Palestinian East Jerusalem, doing things like naming stuff after Jared Kushner. These are not terribly important issues in the big scheme of things. In the end, they have done nothing to advance the core issue in that region, which is, or at least in Israel, of an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement. If anything, we've rolled backwards.
Well, have they made it sort of irrelevant, made it a side issue because Israel has made alliances with other Arab countries against Iran?
Irrelevant, I wouldn't say, no, I wouldn't say irrelevant, but definitely less pressing. There's no question about it. I mean, old line about the Palestinians was never missing an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And they have continued to do that consistently and have just been rejectionist at every point. And meanwhile, the world has moved on and people have discovered that the Middle East is more than just the Israelis and the Palestinians and their conflict. It is a whole broader region with all sorts of interests, and Israel has played it very, very skillfully. But they're in an unstable situation too. They're about to hit their fourth election in 2 years. And again, their prime minister is under criminal indictment. So there's a lot of turmoil to be had. And the Palestinian leadership is aging in a bit of a shambolic state itself.
Eleanor, Joe Biden, people around him, supporters of him, talked about a return to normalcy after Donald Trump. The last time we had a return to normalcy, we got Warren Harding. What is it the American people are really looking for now, do you think?
Do you know, I think a lot of people just really want to wake up every morning and worry about whether their coffee is warm and not about whether the world is ending. I mean, it has been such a strange 4 years. Not only did this president decide he had to shake us up every day he had to get the headlines, and he pretty well did get the headlines every day. So just by being methodical and fairly thoughtful and frankly boring, I think Biden will do exactly what we really need, at least for a while. I mean, look, we've got this huge pandemic that has not gone away yet, especially, I mean, here in New York, who knows when we're going to get the vaccine. It's still sort of rumbling around. We hope that it's been preserved in these various places where it's gone. But, you know, that's enough to worry about. We shouldn't have to worry about a sudden tweet from Joe Biden that is going to shake up the world order. So I really think that's going to be the gift that Biden will give us, at least to give us a breather, at least for a while.
Yeah.
Clyde, if I look back on this year and think about what I learned, more than anything, I think it's how vulnerable democracy has been, how vulnerable public health has been, how vulnerable, I guess, our digital infrastructure has been. What have you learned about 2020 or from 2020?
All of that. 2020 was a particularly bad year for a whole lot of my friends and members of my family. I have never been so glad to see a year go, but I think to go to your first bullet point there, our democracy, it is indeed more fragile than I think a lot of us would like to believe. That in the end, it rests on the goodwill of people. And we're seeing now one of our major parties loaded. Fortunately, it's not yet the majority of that party, I don't think, but it is loaded with anti-democratic, small case D, forces who are simply about power and preserving their view and rejecting anything that opposes it and will not accept defeat. And I never could have dreamed that one bulbous, boorish man like Donald Trump could so turn our country topsy-turvy as he has, but that he has, and it's going to take a while to bring it back to that normality that Eleanor was referring to. I too look forward to the calm that she is discussing, and just not being able to tell this guy, shut up and go away. And I think, by the way, I think he will. I really have a feeling that once January 20th and January 21st come about, that microphone of his is going to be a lot dimmer than it has been.
From your lips.
Clyde Haberman, Eleanor Randolph of the New York Times, thank you so much for joining us. And we'll be back with more on the New York City mayoral race. It's barely 6 months away from the mayoral primary in New York City. Already hopefuls are in campaign mode. In these early stages, there are some 30 mayoral hopefuls who have filed the necessary paperwork, ranging from city council members to business leaders to fringe candidates to high-profile city politicians such as Scott Stringer and Eric Adams. Among those attracting the most notice is Andrew Yang, an entrepreneur who briefly entered the presidential race, but another high-profile hopeful, Max Rose from Staten Island, recently dropped out at this early stage. Dana Rubinstein, a Times Metro reporter, has been on the ground following the latest developments, including the continued influence of the Reverend Al Sharpton. Dana, when Bill de Blasio ran 4 years ago, or 8 years ago rather, he was a progressive coming in when times were relatively good. This past week, the Independent Budget Office came out with a report saying that we are experiencing a nearly unprecedented level of uncertainty, the longest span of consecutive annual demographic decline in 40 years, that the rate of unemployment may continue to fall, but it's still not going to reach the level of 2019, at least past 2024. So why are all these people running for mayor in the first place?
That's a very good question. I mean, Mayor De Blasio has himself said at various points during this crisis that he can't imagine why anyone would want his job. But, you know, power is it's an alluring thing. And I think that the extreme crisis that we're in has opened the field up to all sorts of people who wouldn't normally consider running. There's a sense that there's more opportunity outside of the normal strictures of politics than is normal. And I think that sense of opportunity is created by the crisis.
Is there any big difference ideologically, philosophically among the candidates?
It seems like, first of all, we have no real Republican candidates yet, and the only one who has been open about considering it is John Katz-Matidis, who is a grocery store magnate and doesn't seem like a viable citywide candidate. So basically, you have a bunch of Democrats, more than a dozen, if you exclude the various fringe ones, and they seem to sort of span, you know, a spectrum from centrist for New York centrist, which is probably left of center in the national context, to far left, you know, like Carlos Menchaca, Diane Morales. You know, Diane Morales talks about using eminent domain to take property from that isn't being used by landlords and converting it to housing. It's basically a little bit left to pretty far left.
With the election so far away, of course, it's hard to even guess what's going to happen. But two of the bigger issues that we seem to be facing is racial harmony, one looking at the Black Lives Matter movement all over the country, and also, of course, the impact of the coronavirus on the economy. Some of the candidates embody strengths from both of those things. What do we think people are actually looking for in a mayoral candidate?
I mean, I guess we'll find out in June, but it does seem like a lot of the Black Lives Matter sort of fervor from the summer has ebbed a bit as we deal with some very existential issues surrounding our city. You know, how will we pay for very basic services? I mean, the news out of Georgia would seem to suggest that we'll get more aid from the federal government, but I really haven't met anyone who follows these things closely who thinks that there will be enough aid for every municipality in the country such that we can solve everyone's budgetary problems. I mean, the problems are severe. So, so I don't know. At June will determine the answer to that question, but it does seem like the sort of things are shifting more towards like basic functioning of the city issues.
Dana, there used to be variables that you could count on in a particularly Democratic primary election that would sort of pivot it one way or the other. The party organization, which way that would go, organized labor, where the unions were, who had the most money, perhaps. Is there any indication from that this time, who is ahead, who is in the strongest position? Or do those things really not matter anymore, particularly in a race that, at least at this point, is so crowded?
I think they matter, but not as much as they used to. I mean, the city has a really generous matching funds program. So you have to raise, you know, one of the big questions that will come out of the next filing is, did Maya Wiley raise enough money to qualify for matching funds in the mayoral race? So, you know, there's different metrics now, but you need money to run. The other thing is that Ray McGuire is expected to break like if you raise enough money, even if you're not part of the matching system, you raise the cap for everyone. So to some extent, there is still a money race. But yeah, I mean, the left seems much more, I don't know if atomized is the right word, but less unified than before. There are tensions between progressives and more sort of institutional left organizations like unions. Everything does seem sort of, you know, more diffuse.
And generally, we've said that the Democratic primary is tantamount to election in November. Is that still likely this time?
I mean, unless there's some dark horse candidate that's a Republican, I think that yes, for sure. I mean, there's really no way Catsimatidis can win in New York City. He's very much aligned with, or he has recently very much aligned himself with the Trump faction of the Republican Party. And other than that, the only names that have emerged on the left are like Curtis Sliwa, you know, the founder of the Guardian Angels. So, you know, no one who even remotely seems viable.
Assuming ranked choice voting survives any court challenges, how does that affect the outcome? How does that affect the outcome with so many candidates, at least at this point, running?
It's a very good question, and one that everyone is trying to figure out, and there are all sorts of different theories. So I couldn't possibly tell you the answer. I mean, the one major effect it's supposed to have in the election is just to make it friendlier, but also, you know, with the idea that a candidate will be less likely to, excuse me, I should have turned that off, try to, you know, will be less likely to alienate a competitor in the hopes that they'll be able to garner their votes as a second choice. But I find it hard to believe that any election in New York City is really going to be friendly.
That's a good guess. And I think it also means that probably almost anybody could win in that case. Dana Rubinstein of the New York Times, thank you so much for joining us. And for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.